want to welcome you to our YouTube channel, Escaping the Revolving Door. I'm John LeMaster. You're viewing the 9th video session now of a 12-session course entitled Escaping the Revolving Door of Prison. Be sure to view sessions 1 through 8 if you haven't done that to get a complete understanding of the full course content, and make sure you hit the subscribe button below so that YouTube will notify you and class number 10 will be available for viewing. In our last session, class number 8, entitled Improving Self-Control, Part 1, we looked at the 5th of the 7 major contributors to reoffending that the inmates gave us as reasons for reoffending. They said when they were released from prison, they felt like they just lacked the adequate levels of self-control that ended up causing them to have a lot of difficulty controlling their emotions. To them, it felt to be the source of them not being able to resist temptations, restrain their angry outbursts, and acting in an unhealthy or destructive manner to stressful situations they faced without considering the consequences of their actions. In that class, we first examined and described what self-control is, and then found out what the benefits of having adequate levels of self-control are. We also considered 4 areas that have a strong effect on how we go about developing adequate levels of self-control. In the first one, we developed an understanding of just how our thoughts, our feelings, and our emotions and our behavior are related. In getting that understanding, we took notice of what it's called the cognitive triangle that describes the relationship between those 3 mind and body responses, and found that it was actually our thoughts that ended up controlling our behavior. So to change our behavior, we have to begin to change the way we think, rather than just telling ourselves, hey, we got to quit doing what we're doing, because that method just, as we know, just doesn't seem to work very well. And then secondly, we investigated 6 methods we can use to develop and strengthen our self-control. Here's a summary of those 6 methods if you'd like to take a quick look at those. In our third point, we tried to answer why we do the things we do. We found that everything we do is an attempt to meet our core human needs. Then we went on to describe what core human needs are, as described by a psychologist by the name of Abraham Maslow, and referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and reviewed and viewed those needs in a graphic as Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid. And then lastly, we discussed 10 common thinking errors that all of us have to deal with from time to time, and learned how to overcome these thinking errors to help us feel better about ourselves and to begin to change some of our negative behavior caused by this wrong thinking. In this session, entitled Improving Self-Control, Part 2, we want to continue our study of the 5th of the major contributors to reoffending on how we can improve self-control by learning to understand and control our anger. We want to begin our study on this subject by getting an appreciation for just how this most unpredictable human emotion called anger works, by first looking at some what I'll call real-life examples of anger demonstrated in our society. Then we'll define what anger is and examine some of the reasons why we're subject to getting angry in the first place. And then next we will discuss when anger is harmful, not only to others, but to ourselves as well, and when it's wrong. We'll also answer whether or not anger is a normal human emotion that just has to be controlled, or something we should just try to avoid at all cost. Following that, we'll describe the 4 stages or levels of anger to get a better understanding of the complexity of this thing called anger. Then lastly, we're going to describe and characterize 4 anger management tips and techniques we can use to control our anger. You know, if I were to ask you of all the human emotions we're capable of experiencing, which one seems to be the most difficult for you to cope with? I know it is for me. I believe that the majority of you would say that dealing with the emotion of anger is the most complex and challenging of them all on a day in and day out basis. It's complex because anger can and will surface at the strangest time, as you know. An innocent comment made by someone can be misunderstood, causing our anger to be just set off. And then words, as we learned in our last session, are powerful and can have a triggering effect on us, so that we have to exercise a great deal of self-control and restraint during these word attacks on us by other people. And then it's challenging because anger, if it's not handled properly, can obviously be a very dangerous and destructive emotion. It can be hurtful to us physically and emotionally and relationally, of course, and then spiritually. Anyone who has experienced an incident when they let their anger get the best of them will confirm that their actions committed in a state of anger they later regretted. I think we can all agree that we live in a very angry society. Examples of anger can be seen in all kinds of high school, college, and professional sports, if you've watched some of those. Some pro basketball players have been fined huge sums for venting their anger by punching an official, a coach, or even another player. Even coaches have punched their own players, and in some cases went up into the stands and punched a spectator. An example of this was a basketball coach by the name of Bobby Knight. I don't know if you know him. He's from Indiana. I'm from Indiana, so I know about Bobby. He was a coach at Indiana University from 1971 to 2000 and was famous for his temper tantrums. During some of his stunts, he was known to throw chairs across the basketball court during games if the officials weren't calling the game fairly, according to him. He also punched players who weren't performing well. But the teams he coached in NCAA Division I games won over 900 games, the third highest number of all time by any coach. So he was a great coach that had the ability to motivate players to achieve their greatest potential, but he couldn't control himself. Anger shows up in the business world. An employee explodes in a fit of anger over something the boss said or another employee said. And fired employees sometimes even bring a gun to their place of employment and kill coworkers in a fit of rage. Our anger rarely reaches that intensity, but it can if it's not controlled. You know, you can't even drive down the highway and not be subjected to angry outbursts of cursing or being purposely cut off and the single finger being raised. There have been several cases in the last few years where someone has actually shot someone for pulling out in front of him. I remember recently where 2 men got into an argument over who came to the stop sign first and had the right of way. One shot the other, and that person is now confined to a wheelchair. Anger especially shows up even in the home. A teenager slams the door and retreats into their room. A husband yells at his wife, or a parent abuses their kid some that way. But James 1:19 in the Bible New Testament says, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires for us to have. But when we're angry, the opposite of this happens. We're slow to listen, we're quick to speak, and we're quick to become angry. By the way, the Bible's a very good source to learn values and codes of conduct and behavior to help us live, as I've shown in other videos. It should be a source we look to often as our personal standard to live by. So what is anger? Let's define it. Anger is defined as the emotion of instant displeasure and indignation. Indignation is anger or annoyance provoked by what is perceived as unfair treatment arising from the feeling of deliberate injury done, anticipated, or threatened. This perception of something or someone being unfair is present throughout our culture. The sensitivity of people feeling others or treating them unfairly or being intolerant seems to have just intensified in the last few years. Even on the grade school playground, the words and feelings expressed in the statement, "You're being so unfair," is charged. Well, if we expect to be treated fairly in life, I'm afraid we're all in for an unpleasant surprise. So why do we and others get angry? Obviously, there's a number of reasons why we can get angry, but let's look at just some of the major reasons. One of the primary reasons we can get angry is that we feel threatened. But another one is we can't have our own way. Our ego, our sense of esteem or self-importance has been bruised. We feel like we've been unfairly treated. We might have been cut off in traffic or treated badly at work, or someone has said something ugly to us. Our pride's been injured is another reason. We feel offended or insulted. The words, you're a liar, you're mean-spirited, you're insensitive and intolerant are words that just create anger in all of us. Extreme frustration can make us angry because things just didn't turn out the way we'd planned. Or we may be just extremely tired that can cause anger to rise up to an explosive point. Our families may even feel misunderstood or ignored or unloved or criticized. That can cause them to become angry. And our friends may become angry because they feel left out, disappointed, and ridiculed. Let's look at the traits of a normal, healthy anger. Anger is a natural human feeling or emotion that's an instinctive response to a perceived physical threat or unfair treatment. When human beings become angry, it triggers what's been called a burst of adrenaline. That's a hormone our body makes that prepares the muscles for exertion. That enables us to either defend ourselves or run from the person we fear or the situation that we perceive as threatening. The burst of adrenaline prepares us for what's called the fight or flight response. Anger is considered normal and healthy when it occurs occasionally. It happens in response to a specific trigger or maybe another person, your own personal problems, or an irritating situation like you're stuck in a traffic jam. It's normal if it has a level of intensity that's appropriate to a triggering event. It flares up, but then it subsides or drops back to a normal level within a relatively short time frame. It's expressed with assertiveness. That's confident, cordial behavior, not aggression, which is defined as dominant, hostile behavior. Let's compare the passive, assertive, and aggressive types of persons. Passive person is afraid to speak up. The assertive person speaks openly. And then the aggressive person, he talks above other people and he interrupts other people. The passive person also speaks softly. The assertive person just uses a normal conversational tone. But the aggressive person speaks loudly and abusively. The passive person goes along with what others say or what they think. But the assertive person considers what other people think, but they speak their own mind as well. The aggressive person, though, only considers what they think or say, and they don't care what other people think. Here's another. Passive, the values himself less than other people. The assertive person values himself not greater, but just equal to someone else. But the aggressive person values himself more than other people. Let's go down to the one you might be familiar with. You're okay, I'm not okay, is what the passive person says. The assertive person says, I'm okay and you're okay. But the aggressive person says, I'm okay, but you're not okay. So the preferred and healthy way to express yourself is being assertive, not aggressive. Let's look at some common myths about being assertive. Myth number one is being assertive means you have to be aggressive. Well, that's false, obviously. When we're assertive, we don't raise our voice and try to intimidate others by moving into their personal space or threatening them. When we act assertively, we speak with a normal tone, respect others, but state our opinion and needs and wants. And myth number two, being assertive means getting my way all the time. Well, that's not true. Self-expression doesn't mean you're forcing others to agree with you. Assertive does not guarantee you will always get what you want, obviously. And you allow other people to express themselves while showing respect for their opinion. Myth number three, if assertive, I'll not be liked, so I just have to be a passive person. Well, that's also not true. Being passive means you'll simply follow what everybody else wants to do. People often are annoyed by people who never state their opinion, so they're actually not liked. And then myth number four, being assertive means being selfish. False. Expressing your opinion is not selfish, but a part of being human. Behaving with an assertive attitude means both giving and receiving respect. And then myth number five, the final one. I always have to say yes and do what others want me to do. Well, obviously that's not true. Being assertive means communicating or informing others that you have boundaries and you have limits. We must be able to express what our limits are so that we don't become overloaded. Let me ask this question. Is anger evil, sinful, and harmful? Well, anger's not evil because I've already said it's a normal human emotion, but it must be controlled. If anger is sinful, then how could Jesus himself become angry? In Mark 11 through 15, in the book of Mark appears to describe how Jesus lost his temper when he cleansed the temple of the money changers, as you probably know this scripture. Mark says that Jesus made a whip of cords. He drove those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves out of the temple. He released all the animals. He overturned their tables even. But when you make a careful study of the passage, you find that Jesus went to the temple the night before. That's shown in Mark 11:11. And he had observed what was going on. His anger was a carefully thought out course of action. He was in total control of his emotions. Anger can motivate us to virtue. It's called righteous indignation. You may have heard that term before. But you can use this to virtue to oppose social injustice. For example, MADD, M-A-D-D, that's mothers against drunk drivers, or oppose porn or drugs or abortion. Paul tells us in Ephesians in 4:26, chapter 4, verse 26, that when we're angry, not to sin. He didn't say not to get angry. Anger managed correctly can be an asset and not a liability. Anger is something we can't avoid, but it's something we can learn to control. So when is it sinful, evil, or wrong? Well, when it causes loss of self-control. Anytime anger seeks to inflict harm on another person, it's wrong, no matter how much it's righteously motivated. We can harm others even verbally as well as physically. It's been found that by the psychologist at the University of Jena in Germany that emotional pain inflicted by words that discount and demean, degrade, belittle, or humiliate other people involves that same region of the brain that senses physical pain. So these words inflict so much pain on someone emotionally that the mind equates it as physical pain. When we seek revenge, it's wrong. The statement, "I don't get mad, I get even," speaks to revenge as an improper method to resolve anger. When we allow our anger to reach such an explosive point that we lose control, it's always wrong. Okay, what about being harmful? Is anger harmful? Obviously, because it can be harmful to others. It can even be harmful to your cat or your dog if you take your anger out on your pet. Let's look at the physiology of anger. Losing your temper endangers your health because adrenaline starts to flow. The body prepares for what I said earlier, the fight or flight response, by diverting blood from other parts of the body to the extremities, to the arms, to the legs, to the hands. Your heart beats faster, your blood pressure, breathing rate increase substantially. Signs of anxiety appear, your palms begin to sweat, you get nervous. Doctors suggest that every time we lose our temper, we can subtract 5 to 7 days from our lifespan. Let's examine the stages or levels of anger, the 4 levels. My source here is taken from a sermon by Reverend Bob Russell, who's the senior pastor, was the senior pastor at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. He put it all this way. He said, psychologists tell us that there are 4 words that describe the different levels or types of anger that we experience. Number 1, rage. That's the highest level. It's used to describe a short-fused, intense, explosive, uncontrolled anger. A person in this stage vents his anger, speaks foolish words, and he stirs up conflict. Proverbs 15:18 in the Bible says, "A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who's patient calms a quarrel." The angered person is in a state of rage. He's not seeking a solution to the problem. He just wants to express his discontent. It's a fly off the handle, let it all out temper that leaves you and everybody around you torn to pieces. We try to excuse it by saying, that's just the way I am. I just couldn't help it. It made me so angry. Hot tempers run in my family. That's basically a learned behavior that they accepted as a way to get their way. Perhaps a parent or a sibling, a brother or sister, used that to get their way. Will Rogers, the old cowboy actor, humorist, and social commentator of the early 1900s, once said, "People who fly into a rage seldom make a good landing." When you lose your temper, you always lose. People who express this type of anger are walking time bombs with hair-trigger tempers ready to explode. Let's label rage as a sudden anger that must be controlled. The next level down from that is wrath. It's used to describe an anger that wants revenge, that desires to retaliate, or that wants to return the hurt or injustice the offender has caused them. It's an anger that holds a grudge. It's an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. I don't get mad, I get even kind of anger, as I just mentioned. An unforgiving spirit always accompanies a wrathful anger. Austin O'Malley said that revenge is often like biting a dog because the dog bit you. Wrath anger was what the Pharisees felt toward Jesus. They had built their own religious playhouse by taking the laws of God and attaching hundreds of their own additions to it, making it almost impossible to keep the original laws of God. The truth Jesus came teaching began to dismantle their playhouse, and the Pharisees got fighting mad. Luke 6:11 says, "But they, the Pharisees, were furious at Jesus and began to plot with each other what they might do to him to get even." Let's label wrath as a sinful anger that has to be condemned. The next level down is just resentment. It's used to describe an anger that stems from a grievance. It's an anger that a person suppresses over a long period of time and allowed to smolder and fester and fume down inside them. This type of anger has been used in court proceedings to defend wives that kill their husbands after they've been abused over some period of time. Resentment anger doesn't blow up, it clams up. This person makes himself sick and tense and miserable and pities himself. He turns bitter inside and resentful and unforgiving. As the anger is cultivated inside the person, it produces self-pity, and that pity eventually turns into bitterness. Resentment anger is what the older son felt toward his prodigal brother and father in the parable of the prodigal son that Jesus taught us, is recorded in Luke Gospel chapter 15. He'd been the good son, the faithful son, the stay-at-home son, stay on the job kind of son. His brother was the bad son, the vagabond, the unfaithful one, the lazy one. Now that son was back at home. The father had celebrated his return with a party for him. And his older son was overcome with resentful anger. He resented his brother and his father for receiving his wayward brother back into the family. He refused to let go of his angry resentment and join the party. Read Luke 15:28-30. Resentment anger damages the human personality and destroys relationships with others. Proverbs 18:19 says it's harder to win back the friendship of offended brother than to capture a fortified city. His anger just shuts you out like iron bars. So let's label resentment as a stubborn anger that just has to be conquered. And then the final level of anger is just indignation that I mentioned earlier. It's used to describe an anger that rises up as a result of seeing someone or something of importance to us being mistreated or suffering an injustice. This type of anger is provoked by what is perceived as unfair treatment. Indignation anger is free from rage and resentment and retaliation. It's a healthy anger aimed at the problem, but not the person. It's an anger for the right reason expressed in the right way. It's a controlled anger that's meant to be corrective and constructive. Indignation anger is the kind Jesus displayed. The gospel tells us of Jesus becoming angry on several occasions, but it was always that indignation type aimed at correcting a wrongful practice or adjusting an unhealthy attitude. Mark 3, 1 through 6 reveals the kind of thing that triggered the indignation, anger of Jesus. The Pharisees had lost their compassion for other people. They cared not for the condition of the man that Jesus healed with a withered hand. All that mattered was that maintaining legalistic obedience to the letter of the law. They believed that their traditions were far more important than easing the pain or meeting the needs of another human being. They had forgotten that Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2:27. This is the spirit of the law. Whereas they wanted Jesus to obey the letter of the law. Since God knew that mankind had to observe rest in order for his body to recover, he put in place the Sabbath so he would not work every single day of the week. The Pharisees had began over the years to define precisely what each person could do on the Sabbath in order to make sure they were observing God's letter of the law command. As I remember, that you could walk 1/8 of a mile on the Sabbath. That was in the entire distance that you could walk, according to them. The intent of the Sabbath was to keep it holy, to allow a person to draw near to God and to rest from labors, so their body could recover from that full 6 days of labor. Jesus looks at them in anger. He's stirred with indignation because of their compassionless mindset. Notice how Jesus expressed his anger. He didn't explode in a rage. He didn't call down fire from heaven on them in wrath. He didn't allow resentment and anger to smolder inside of him. He didn't suppress his anger. Jesus chose to channel his anger into carefully chosen words of response. Which is lawful in the Sabbath? To do good or do evil? To save life or to kill? He didn't respond in a way that would allow them to fight back. Let's label indignation as a sanctified or purified anger that must be channeled. Now let's look at 3 ways that people tend to handle their anger. The first way is they repress it or they contain it. Repression is a process of hindering angry thoughts or desires so that it remains unconscious. We're told this is a form of denial. Their thinking goes something like this. If I just ignore it or avoid it, it'll just go away. But repression's not a healthy way to handle anger. It's not an emotion that can be dealt with by simply forgetting it. Repressed emotions don't vanish. They can reemerge in other forms at different times and affect mental and physical health of individuals. They can cause mental health issues like anxiety and stress and memory problems and depression, and be responsible for so many physical symptoms as well, like pain, fatigue, nausea, digestive problems, ulcers, high blood pressure, a number of things. The next way is they suppress it. In suppressing anger, we choose to restrain expressing it and simply hold it inside of us. By doing this, we are silently nurturing it within and allowing it to simmer on the back burner of our mind, so to speak. If this simmering anger is not allowed to be discharged or let out, depressurized some way, we'll usually vent it on another unsuspecting person. Normally that's a family member. This is called displaced or projected anger. We all have experienced this method of handling anger. We may get chewed out by the boss at work, but in order to keep from blowing up and losing our job, we just suppress our anger. But when we get home, we unload on a member of our family at the slightest problem or issue that comes up. Repressing and suppressing anger are not the best ways to deal with anger. And the final way is they express it. Since the 70s, we've become a nation that's been told to get our feelings out in the open. As long as releasing anger is done in a constructive way, that's perfectly okay. But when people get angry, their thinking process gets short-circuited and they don't think rationally. A sign I remember reading says, always make sure your brain is engaged before putting your mouth in gear. I love that line. Knowing when and how to release anger is important. A wise wife knows it's better to unload the frustrations of her day onto the husband after he's had time to sit down and unwind after a long, hard day at work. The proper expression of anger is remembering the results of an occurrence of uncontrolled anger. Thinking before responding. When you sense that you're getting angry, what do? Delay your response. Allow it to cool down. Proverbs 16:23 says, intelligent people think before they speak. Restraining your remarks. Someone has said it's better to use sweet words in response to someone when you're angry, because you may have to eat those words later. Let's try to get a better understanding of anger. Do you find yourself getting into frequent arguments and fights? Anger is a normal, healthy emotion, but when explosive anger spirals out of control, it can have serious consequences for your relationships, your health, and your state of mind. With insight about the real reasons for your anger and some anger management tools, you can learn to keep your temper from hijacking your life. Psychologists tell us that anger is a control mechanism that was developed during our childhood as we saw people using it to get what they wanted. An emotion of anger is neither good nor bad. It's perfectly healthy and normal to feel angry when you've been mistreated or wronged. The feeling isn't the problem, it's what you do with it that makes a difference. Anger becomes a problem when it harms you or it harms other people. If you have a hot temper, you may feel like it's out of your hands. There's little you can do to tame the beast. But you have more control over your anger than you think. You can learn to express your emotions without hurting other people. And when you do, you'll not only feel better, you'll also likely to get your needs met. Mastering the art of anger management takes work. But the more practice, the easier to get, and the payoff will be huge. Learning to control your anger and express it appropriately can help you build better relationships, achieve your goals, and lead a healthier lifestyle. So why anger management is important? Well, you might think venting your anger is healthy, that people around you are just too sensitive, that your anger is justified, or that you need to show your fury to get some respect. I just don't get no respect, as Rodney Dangerfield said. But the truth is that anger is much more likely to damage your relationships, impair your judgment, get in the way of your success, and have a negative impact on the way people see you. Now as I said earlier, let's investigate 4 anger management tips and techniques we can all use to help us control our anger and channel it for good. Anger management tip number 1, explore what's really behind your anger. If you're struggling with out of control anger, you may be wondering why your fuse is so short. Anger problems often stem from what you learned as a child. If you watched others in the family scream, hit each other, or throw things, you might think that this is the way you're supposed to express your anger. Anger is often a cover-up for other feelings. In order to get your needs met and express your anger in appropriate ways, you need to get in touch with what you're really feeling. Are you angry? Are you truly angry? Or is your anger masking other feelings such as embarrassment or insecurity or shame, vulnerability? If your knee-jerk reaction in many situations is to get angry, it's very likely that your temper is covering up your true feelings. Clues that there's more to your anger. You have a hard time compromising. It's hard for you to understand other people's points of view, and even harder to concede a point. If you grew up in a family where anger was out of control, as I mentioned, you remember how the angry person always got his way by being the loudest and most abusive and most demanding. Don't get locked in on having things your way. Sometimes you have to give a little to gain a little. That's called a win-win situation. Both parties in any contract or agreement must feel that they've gained something for an agreement to work effectively. Next, do you have trouble expressing emotions other than anger? Do you pride yourself on being tough and in control, never letting your guard down? Do you feel that emotions like fear, guilt, and shame don't apply to you? You know, everyone has these emotions. And if you think you don't, you may be using anger as a cover-up for them. You view different opinions and viewpoints as a personal challenge. Do you believe that your way is always right and get angry when others disagree? If you have a strong need to be in control, or you have a fragile ego, it's called, you may interpret others' perspective as a challenge to your authority. Let's look at the dynamics of anger. We become angrier when we are stressed. We are rarely ever angry for the reason we think we are. We are often angry when we didn't get what we were needed or were hurt as a child. We often become angry when we see a trait in others we can't stand in ourselves. One person said the hardest person on an alcoholic is another alcoholic. Underneath many current angers are old disappointments, traumas, and triggers. When we get angry when a current event brings up an unresolved situation in our past, we often feel a strong emotion when a situation has a similar content, words or energy that we felt before. The source for that is a book called Get Your Angries Out. Anger management tip number 2, be aware of your anger warning signs and your triggers. Or you might feel that you just explode into anger without any warning whatsoever. You know, there are physical warning signs in your body. Anger is a normal physical response. It fuels that fight or flight. The angrier you get, the more the body goes into overdrive. Becoming aware of your own personal signs of your temper to start into a boil allows you to take steps to manage your anger before it gets out of control. Just pay attention to some of those feelings in your body. These are warning signs. That tight feeling in your stomach, that wringing in your hands, breathing faster, a throbbing headache, pacing about, a pounding heart, tensing your shoulder and neck muscles, having to rub your neck. Identify the negative thought patterns that trigger your temper. You may think that external things, the insensitive actions of other people, for example, or frustrating situations are what cause your anger. But anger problems have less to do with what happens to you than how you interpret them. So train yourself to think rationally. Anger often causes people to exaggerate the truth of a situation because it allows them to justify their excessive response. When you train your brain to see the facts of a situation, you deny yourself justification for going into an over-the-top kind of rage. One of the ways is practice really good listening skills. People get defensive when they feel they've been criticized or verbally attacked. Instead of lashing out in anger when such a situation crops up, focus on listening carefully to what the other person's saying. That gives you time to find a way to resolve these situations in a calm, thoughtful manner. Common negative thinking patterns that trigger and fuel anger include the 10 thinking errors that we covered in class number 8, Improving Self-Control, Part 1. Here's just a few of them. Remember the overgeneralizing. You always interpret me. Or you interrupt me. You never consider my needs. Everyone disrespects me. I never get the credit I deserve. Another one, mind reading and jumping to conclusions. Remember the 2 + 2 = 5? Assuming you know what someone else is thinking or feeling. That he or she intentionally upset you, ignored your wishes, or disrespected you. And then blaming, if you'll remember that one. When anything bad happens or something goes wrong, it's always someone else's fault. You blame others for the things that happen to you rather than taking responsibility for your own life. One of the things that we can do is avoid people, places, and situations that bring out your worst. Stressful events don't excuse anger, but understanding how these events affect you can help you to take control of your environment and avoid unnecessary aggravation. Now look at your regular routine and try to identify activities, times of day, people especially, places or situations that trigger irritable or angry feelings. Maybe you get into a fight every time you go out with a certain group of friends. Or maybe the traffic on your daily commute drives you crazy. Then think about ways you can avoid these triggers or view the situation differently so it doesn't make your blood boil. Anger management tip number 3, learn ways to cool down. Obviously, this is a very important one. Once you know how to recognize the warning signs that their temper is rising and anticipate your triggers, you can act quickly to deal with your anger before it spins out of control. There are many techniques that you can use to help cool down and keep your anger in check. Let's look at some of the quick tips for cooling down. Focus on the physical sensations of your anger. While it may seem like faulty thinking, turning into the way your body feels when your anger rises, lessens the emotional intensity of your anger. Take some deep breaths. Slow, deep breathing helps counteract the rising tension caused by a situation. The key is to breathe deeply from the abdomen, getting as much fresh air as possible into your lungs. Next one is an exercise. A brisk walk around the block's a great idea. It releases pent-up energy so you can approach a situation with a cooler head. Stretch or massage those areas of tension. Roll your shoulders if you're tensing them up, for example, or massaging your neck. I do this tilting my head back and forth to help relieve some of that stress in my neck. And give yourself a reality check. When you start getting upset about something, take a moment to think about the situation and ask these kinds of questions. Is it really worth getting angry about? Is this worth ruining the rest of my day? And is my response appropriate to the situation? And then anger management tip number 4. Find healthier ways to express your anger. If you decided that the situation is worth getting angry about and there's something you can do to make it better, the key is to express your feelings in a healthy way. When communicated respectfully and channeled effectively, anger can be a tremendous source of energy and inspiration for change. Pinpoint exactly what you're angry about. Have you ever gotten into an argument over something silly? I have. Big fights often happen over the very smallest thing, a dish left out or being late a few minutes. But there's usually a bigger issue behind it. If you find your irritation and anger rapidly rising, ask yourself, what am I really angry about here? Identify the real source of the frustration. It'll help you communicate your anger better. Take constructive action and Work toward a resolution. Take 5 if things get too heated. If your anger seems to be spiraling out of control, remove yourself from the situation for a few minutes, or as long as it takes to cool down. A brisk walk, a trip to the gym, a few minutes listening to some music will allow you to calm down. Release that pent-up emotion and then approach the situation with a cooler head. And then always fight fair. It's okay to be upset at someone, but if you don't fight fair, the relationship will quickly break down. Fighting fair allows you to express your own needs while still respecting someone else. Focus on the present. Once you're in the heat of an argument, it's so easy to start throwing up past grievances into the mix. Rather than looking to the past and assigning blame, focus on what you can do in the present to solve this particular problem. The next, choose your battles. Conflicts can be draining, so it's important to consider whether the issue is really worth your time and energy. If you pick your battles rather than fighting over every little thing, others will take you more seriously when you're upset. And then be willing to forgive. Resolving conflict is impossible if you're unwilling or unable to forgive. I love the 3 R's of forgiveness. Resolution lies in releasing the desire to retaliate. The 3 R's of forgiveness. And know when to let something go. If you can't come to an agreement, agree to disagree. It takes 2 people to get an argument, get an argument going and to keep it going. If a conflict is going nowhere, you can choose to disengage and just move on at a later time. So let's look conclusively. In conclusion, let's say, anger is just too unpredictable to allow it to be in control of you. God wants us to be free from anger that would hinder our Christian testimony. Philippians 2:13 tells us that God is at work in us to remove and take out of us all those spots and wrinkles and blemishes. If this class has been a benefit to you, please subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below so that YouTube will message you when class number 10 will be available for viewing. And be sure to tune in to our next session of Escaping the Revolving Door of Prison, session number 10, entitled Overcoming a Dysfunctional Family Background. This is John LeMaster saying, I'll be looking for you in our next session.